Mr. LaHood to inquire.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Brady for putting on this hearing today. Obviously, it's very important. It's very relevant to this issue of public policy, and I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony in being here today. My district in West Central Illinois is kind of a poster child for infrastructure. I represent 19 counties. And whether it's roads and bridges or it's rail, I have the Mississippi River and the Illinois River that run through my district. So locks and dams are important, and transit in the cities that I represent. And I think it's good news. We've heard a lot today on both sides of the aisle about agreement on the country's infrastructure. And of course, figuring out how you pay for it is the answer we're trying to get to on all of this. And a multifaceted approach, I think, has to be the policy we engage in, and we've heard about public-private partnerships and vehicle miles traveled and user fees and indexing the gas tax. And I think looking at all those is important. And obviously, we have a responsibility and an obligation on the Ways and Means Committee to address the shortfalls in the Highway Trust Fund. The Congressional Budget Office projects shortfalls beginning in FY21. And obviously, there's many reasons for this. The motor fuel taxes have not been raised in 25 years. Fuel economy standards have increased. And not all users pay into the Highway Trust Fund for a variety of reasons, including going to electric and non-fossil fueled vehicles. But the bottom line is the Highway Trust Fund is broke, and we need to figure out a way to fix that. Having said that, when we talk about indexing the gas tax, you know, and I don't want to get into a Republican or Democrat issue on this. I think we're close to 30 states now that have raised the gas tax. I think well over 20 of those have been Republican governors in Indiana and Iowa and Michigan that have stepped up, Ohio, to raise the gas tax. And so, you know, they obviously have looked at it and figured out the way to do it. In Illinois, we put a measure on the ballot a couple years ago that said, if you knew the money was going into a lockbox and only spent on roads and bridges and infrastructure, would you support it? Well, overwhelmingly they did. And so when we look at how do we assure the public, because many of my constituents are very dubious of the federal government taking more of their money, going into a big black hole and never being spent on infrastructure. And I think we have, again, a responsibility to assure the public on how to do that in a responsible way. And I think that will give us more, give us a better ability to get something done on infrastructure. Mr. Gribben, I was going to ask you if you have any comments on that, on how we should address that.
Yeah, no, I think that's, thank you, Congressman, and appreciate your family's commitment to infrastructure. That is an excellent question. And one of the reasons why the administration supported funding an incentive program to help state and local governments that were increasing revenue streams for infrastructure is exactly the dynamic you talked about. I think the public is very skeptical of sending dollars very far away to have them come back. Virginia has created 2 different tax districts, one here in Northern Virginia, one in Hampton Roads area. Very, very successful, generating a lot of revenue. So I think when you think about infrastructure, yes, the Highway Trust Fund is important, but it's actually a relatively small component of infrastructure as a whole. If we think more about total investment in infrastructure, what can the federal government do to incentivize that pie to grow? It's really more about stimulating and overcoming political opposition at the state and local level than it is about generating new federal revenue.
Gotcha. Thank you. Let me just switch. When we talk about electric vehicles, from the standpoint of how do we fairly and appropriately assess the responsibility of those users of the road, can you give me your thoughts on that, Mr. Gribben?
Yes, a number of states actually have put in registration fees for electric vehicles, which is perfectly appropriate. I think one would argue those are set relatively low, if that's fair, Mr. Lee, that based upon how much gas they would spend otherwise. That's a nice first step. Obviously, if you move towards user fees, tolling, vehicle miles traveled, those issues wash away, and people, regardless what type of vehicle you're driving, you're paying the same per mile charge.
And how do you think we are making progress on the concerns about privacy as it relates to vehicles miles traveled?
Technology is catching up with that. So 2 factors. One, technology is getting better and allowing us to determine what fees are owed without violating privacy. And secondly, my kids don't seem to care about privacy. So I think culturally, we are changing in a manner where probably in the not too distant future, people will be less fussed about that.
Thank you. Those are all my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Let me call